April 14th, 1865, a Friday. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in United States history, had just ended. 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered. The streets of Washington were erupting in celebration, flags everywhere, fireworks, crowds singing on street corners, and the man who had carried the entire Union on his shoulders, who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, who had buried a son, who had slept only a few hours a night for 4 straight years of war, finally allowed himself to relax. He went to the theater. He would not leave alive. In less than 10 seconds, a single gunshot would end the life of the most beloved and most hated president in American history. But what happened that night at Ford's Theater wasn't an isolated crime. It was only the opening move of something much bigger, a conspiracy to decapitate the entire United States government in a single night, carried out by one of the most famous, best-paid men in the country. And what came after? The manhunt, 12 days of chaos, the final standoff, and a military tribunal that would hang a woman for the first time in U.S. Federal history is a story most people only know half of. This is the full story of America's darkest night, and the 12 days of chaos that followed it. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the man. Abraham Lincoln wasn't, originally, a radical abolitionist. He'd come to the presidency in 1860, promising only to stop the expansion of slavery into new territories. And that alone was enough to make 11 southern states secede from the Union before he'd even been sworn in. What followed was the Civil War. 4 years of fighting, more than 600,000 dead, and a country on the brink of permanent collapse. Lincoln had visibly aged during the war. Photos from 1860 show a thin but vigorous man. Photos from early 1865 show sunken eyes, deep lines, a man carrying the weight of an entire nation. He himself told friends in letters that he'd felt half dead inside for years. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, said he'd been having disturbing dreams for weeks, including one which he shared with friends just days before his death, where he wandered through the White House and found a covered coffin with soldiers weeping around it. When he asked who had died, the answer was the president. He was killed by an assassin. But by April 1865, there was real hope. Richmond, the Confederate capital, had fallen. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, in a display of dignity that impressed even his enemies. Just days before his death, Lincoln had given a speech about Reconstruction, about reintegrating the South into the Union without vengeance, without mass trials, without executing Confederate leaders. And more than that, about giving the right to vote to freed black men, especially those who had served in the Union Army. In 1865, that was revolutionary and dangerous. That speech, delivered on April 11, 1865, from the White House balcony to an ecstatic crowd, sealed his fate. In the audience, listening to every word with mounting hatred, was one of the most famous, best-paid actors in the United States, John Wilkes Booth. Witnesses later said that when Booth heard Lincoln mention voting rights for freedmen, he turned to a companion beside him and muttered something like, "That is the last speech he will ever make." Booth wasn't a lone lunatic or some fringe fanatic. He came from one of the most respected acting families in America. His father and brother were Shakespearean stars across the country, and Booth himself could earn in a single year more money than most Americans made in a lifetime. He was praised by critics, adored by crowds of women, and rich. He was only 26 years old. He was also a fervent Confederate sympathizer, a man who saw slavery as a natural, correct part of the American social order, and who considered Lincoln a tyrant destroying the nation he loved. In letters and diary entries, Booth described himself not as an assassin, but as a patriot willing to make a sacrifice, comparing himself, with no apparent irony, to Brutus killing Caesar. Originally, Booth's plan wasn't to kill Lincoln. it was to kidnap him. The idea was to capture the president alive, take him to Confederate territory, and trade him for thousands of Southern prisoners of war. Booth spent months recruiting a small circle of conspirators for the mission: Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, old schoolmates, George Atzerodt, a German carriage maker who knew the region's rivers and escape routes well, David Harold, a young pharmacist who knew every road in Maryland, and Lewis Powell, a huge, violent ex-Confederate soldier. Every kidnapping attempt fell apart, derailed by last-minute changes to the president's schedule or by the conspirators' own lack of nerve. Once Richmond fell and the Confederacy collapsed, the whole prisoner exchange plan stopped making any practical sense. But Booth, increasingly obsessed and increasingly drunk, decided that kidnapping wasn't enough anymore. After hearing Lincoln speak about voting rights for black men, he gathered his conspirators at a boarding house in Washington, run by Mary Surratt, a Southern widow sympathetic to the Confederate cause, and laid out a far more ambitious, far darker plan. This wouldn't just be an assassination, it would be a simultaneous decapitation of the entire American government in a single night. The main target was Lincoln. Booth assigned Lewis Powell, the giant ex-soldier, to break into the home of Secretary of State William Seward, the second most powerful man in government, and kill him in his own bed, where he was recovering from a carriage accident. George Atzerodt was given the job of assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson in his room at the Kirkwood House Hotel. The idea was simple and brutal. Eliminate the three most important figures in the presidential line of succession on the same night, plunging the entire government into total chaos right at the moment of the Union's victory, may be enough to reignite the war or at least paralyze the country at the very moment of its triumph. On the afternoon of April 14th, Booth stopped by Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. The theater also served as a kind of local hangout for actors, and it was there, by chance, that he learned Lincoln would be attending a performance of Our American Cousin that very night. As a well-known actor, he had free run of the entire building. He knew every hallway, every door, every hiding spot, and had performed there dozens of times. He spent the rest of the afternoon working out the final details with almost professional coldness. He drilled a small peephole into the door of the presidential box so he could look inside before entering. He prepared a wooden bar to jam the hallway door shut from the inside, blocking any immediate pursuit. He had a fast horse waiting in the alley behind the theater, held by a young accomplice. At 8:30 p.m., Lincoln arrived at the theater with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and a young couple as guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The play had already started. The entire audience rose and applauded when the president walked in. The orchestra stopped and struck up "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln waved, smiled, and settled into the box, decorated with American flags. The officer assigned to guard the door of the presidential box that night, a Metropolitan Police officer named John Frederick Parker, left his post during intermission. Accounts differ on whether he wanted a better view of the play or slipped out for a drink at a bar next door. The door was left completely unguarded. Parker was never formally punished for the failure, and exactly where he was in that moment has never been fully settled. Booth knew the box was unprotected. He knew the play by heart, he'd seen it performed multiple times, and knew exactly which scene would draw the audience's biggest laugh, a line that always brought down the house, drowning out any other sound. Around 10:15 p.m., during that exact scene, Booth slipped quietly through the unguarded door of the box. From just a few feet away, he raised a small .44 caliber Derringer pistol, a single-shot weapon small enough to hide in his palm, and fired directly into the back of the president's head. Major Rathbone, realizing what was happening, tried to grab Booth. Booth slashed the major's arm nearly to the bone with a dagger he was carrying, then leapt from the balustrade of the box straight down to the stage, a fall of nearly 13 feet. As he jumped, his boot caught on an American flag draped over the box, and he broke his left leg on landing. Even limping, even injured, Booth pulled himself up in front of the entire stunned audience, turned to face the crowd, and shouted in Latin, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants, the official motto of the state of Virginia. Some in the audience swore he also shouted, "The South is avenged," before limping off stage, mounting the waiting horse in the alley, and vanishing into the Washington night. The whole thing, from the gunshot to the leap, took less than 10 seconds. The entire audience, including Mary Todd Lincoln sitting right beside her husband, watched it happen without even being able to process, in the moment, what they'd just seen. Lincoln was carried out of the theater, still unconscious, by soldiers and bystanders. A young doctor in the audience, Dr. Charles Leal, was first to reach the box and immediately recognized how severe the wound was. They decided not to risk the trip back to the White House. The carriage ride over cobblestone streets could kill him before they arrived. Instead, they carried him into a small house across the street, the Peterson House, home to a German tailor. Lincoln, at nearly 6'4", was too tall for the guest room bed available, so he was laid diagonally across it, his feet hanging off the mattress. Doctors knew immediately the wound was fatal. The bullet had passed through his skull and lodged behind one eye. There was no possible surgery, no treatment of the era that could save him. All that was left was to wait. And Lincoln, surprisingly strong physically, despite all the exhaustion of the war, would hold on for 9 long hours. Through that entire night, the small room filled with doctors, cabinet members, generals, and senators arriving as word spread through the city. Mary Todd Lincoln went in and out of the room, inconsolable, fainting more than once at the sight of her husband. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton effectively took command of the entire U.S. government that same night, sitting in an adjoining room, issuing orders, questioning witnesses, coordinating the manhunt for the conspirators, while the president kept breathing, weaker and weaker, in the next room. At almost the exact same moment, Lewis Powell forced his way into Secretary of State Seward's home, claiming to be delivering medicine, and stabbed both the secretary and several family members who tried to protect him. Seward survived, badly disfigured on his face and neck, saved in part by a metal surgical brace he was already wearing from the earlier carriage accident. George Atzerodt, meanwhile, tasked with killing Vice President Johnson, completely lost his nerve. Instead of going up to Johnson's hotel room, he spent the night drinking at the hotel bar, then simply vanished into the streets, abandoning his part of the plot. The plan to decapitate the entire government had only partly failed. But the most important part, the central, symbolic target, had already been carried out. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, surrounded by nearly his entire cabinet, Abraham Lincoln died, never having regained consciousness. Stanton, standing beside the body, is said to have spoken the line that would become one of the most quoted in American history. Now, he belongs to the ages. What followed was one of the largest manhunts ever mounted on American soil up to that point. Thousands of Union soldiers, federal detectives, and armed civilians combed through Maryland and Virginia, searching for Booth, who was fleeing with a broken leg, aided by a quiet network of Confederate sympathizers scattered across the region. During the escape, Booth and his companion David Harold stopped at the home of a country doctor, Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg, without knowing, or perhaps pretending not to know, who he was treating. That single act would cost Mudd years in prison, and his name would enter the English language. The American phrase, "his name is Mudd," still used today to describe someone publicly disgraced, is often linked, though the connection is debated among historians, to this very episode. For 12 full days, Booth hid in forests, swamps, and isolated farms, reading smuggled newspapers by candlelight. Stunned to discover that instead of being hailed as a hero by the South he believed he was avenging, he was universally condemned, even by Confederate generals and former supporters of the slaveholding cause, who saw the assassination as nothing but one more tragedy heaped onto an already devastated country. On April 26th, 12 days after the assassination, Union cavalry finally tracked Booth down, hiding in a tobacco barn on an isolated farm in Virginia near the Rappahannock River. Completely surrounded, he refused to surrender. The soldiers set fire to the wooden barn to force him out. In the middle of the blaze, a sergeant named Boston Corbett, a deeply religious man who, years earlier, had mutilated himself following a literal reading of a Bible verse, disobeyed direct orders to take Booth alive and fired through the burning barn's wooden slats. The bullet struck Booth almost in the exact same spot on the neck where he himself had shot Lincoln. He was dragged outside, paralyzed from the neck down, and died a few hours later, staring at his own hands in the early morning light, whispering his last words, "Useless, useless." The rest of the conspirators were caught one by one over the following weeks. Powell was found hiding near Mary Surratt's boarding house. Atzerodt was captured at a relative's home. Harold surrendered at the very same barn where Booth died, hands raised. 4 of them, Powell, Atzerodt, Harold, and Mary Surratt herself, owner of the boarding house where the plot had been hatched, were tried before a military tribunal rather than a civilian court, an extremely controversial decision at the time and still debated by historians and legal scholars today. All 4 were found guilty and sentenced to hang. On July 7, 1865, less than 3 months after the assassination, all 4 were hanged simultaneously in a Washington courtyard. Mary Surratt became that day the first woman ever executed by the U.S. federal government, a fact that remains controversial to this day, since many historians question whether the evidence against her truly justified the death penalty or whether she paid in part for a crime committed by her own son who had fled the country and was never put on trial. Lincoln's death wasn't just the loss of one man. It was the loss of an entire plan for the nation's future. Lincoln had made clear in speeches and private conversations that he intended to rebuild the South with mercy, reintegrating the defeated states without humiliation, without mass trials of Confederate leaders, and protecting the rights of freedmen through steady, gradual progress. His successor, Andrew Johnson, the very man Booth had tried and failed to have assassinated that same night, was a man of far more limited vision, far less political skill, and sympathies much closer to the old slave-holding South. The Reconstruction era that followed under Johnson's leadership was marked by deep setbacks, widespread racial violence, the rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and decades of segregationist laws that might have taken a very different course under the leadership Booth silenced that April night. More than 160 years later, Ford's Theater still stands in Washington, now a museum, and the Peterson House across the street remains exactly as it was that tragic early morning. That night is still studied, debated, and remembered as the moment the United States, freshly emerged from its bloodiest war, also lost its best chance at a faster, far less painful healing. Sic semper tyrannis, Booth shouted that night, convinced he was freeing his country from a tyrant. But history, slowly but absolutely unmistakably, would judge very differently just who the real tyrant had been that night.